Sometimes the ones who need saving the most are the ones doing the rescuing. Wes Mallery knew that loneliness better than most at 60 years old. He'd lost his brother, and with him, the last thread connecting him to family. On a cold October morning, during his usual walk through the woods, he heard desperate cries coming from the creek. A dog was trapped under a fallen log, terrified and hurt. Without thinking twice, Wes jumped into that freezing water and lifted that log with his bare hands. He carried the shaking animal home, not knowing this moment would change everything. What began as one act of kindness became a journey back to life itself. Could this frightened dog help a grieving man find his way home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road that most people had forgotten existed. Wes Mallery had bought the property 15 years ago, back when his wife was still alive, and they dreamed of a quieter life, away from the noise of the suburbs. The place wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that had seen better days, and a workshop out back, where Wes spent most of his time now. But it was surrounded by 40 acres of dense forest, and that was what mattered. Every morning, Wes woke at dawn, not because he wanted to, but because his body had learned the rhythm over 60 years and saw no reason to change it now. He'd make coffee in the old percolator that had belonged to his parents, stand at the kitchen window and watch the sun filter through the oak trees that lined his property. The light came in golden and soft this time of year, painting everything with the warm colors of October. His wife, Catherine, used to say that fall was God's way of showing off. She'd loved this season, the changing leaves, the crisp air, the way the world seemed to take a breath before winter settled in. Wes still thought about her every morning when he made that coffee. 8 years gone now, and he still reached for 2 mugs before remembering he only needed 1. The workshop was where Wes felt most at peace. He'd been a carpenter his whole working life, first as an apprentice to his father, then running his own business for 30 years before retiring. The shop smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, familiar scents that brought him comfort. Half-finished projects lined the walls, a bookshelf for Phyllis next door, a jewelry box he'd started for no one in particular, and in the corner, covered with a tarp, a rocking chair he hadn't touched in 6 months. That rocking chair had been meant for his brother. Lloyd Mallery had been 2 years younger than Wes, but you'd never know it from how he acted. Always the adventurous one, always pushing Wes to take risks, to try new things, to live a little. Lloyd had carved Wes a walking stick years ago, back when Wes first bought this property. It was a beautiful piece of work, solid hickory, with careful notches for grip, and a rounded handle that fit perfectly in Wes's palm. "You're going to need this out here," Lloyd had said, handing it over with that crooked grin of his. "All that wandering around in the woods like Thoreau. Just promise me you won't start writing poetry." Wes carried that stick on every walk now. It was one of the few things he had left of his brother. The accident had happened in April. Lloyd had been driving home from a job site when a driver ran a red light. The police said he died instantly, that he didn't suffer. Wes supposed that was meant to be comforting, but it didn't feel that way. It just felt like Lloyd was there one day and gone the next, with no chance to say goodbye, no final conversation, no last laugh shared over a beer. After Lloyd died, Wes had stopped working on the rocking chair. He'd stopped taking on new carpentry projects altogether. He still went through the motions, waking up, making coffee, walking the trails, but it all felt hollow. The days blended together in a grey sameness that he couldn't seem to shake. Phyllis Crane, his neighbour, checked on him regularly. She was 72, widowed herself, and had a way of showing up at his door with casseroles and concern. Wes appreciated it, even when he pretended to be annoyed by her fussing. "You can't just hide out here forever, Wes," she'd say, standing in his doorway with another dish covered in aluminum foil. Lloyd wouldn't want that. Wes knew she was right, but knowing something and doing something about it were 2 different things entirely. The town was small, barely 3,000 people, and everyone knew everyone else's business. Wes had grown up here, left for a while to work in the city, then returned when Catherine got sick. She'd wanted to die in a place where she could see trees and hear birds, not surrounded by concrete and car horns. So they'd come back, and after she passed, Wes had stayed because he didn't know where else to go. Dr. Hugh Brennan ran the only veterinary clinic in town. He was a good man, maybe 10 years younger than Wes, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that put animals at ease. Wes had met him a few times over the years at the hardware store or the diner, exchanged pleasantries about the weather or fishing conditions. They weren't friends exactly, but there was a mutual respect between them. The October storms had been fierce that year. 3 days of heavy rain had swollen the creek that ran through Wes's property, turning the normally gentle stream into a rushing torrent. Trees had come down all over the forest, old oaks that couldn't withstand the wind, pines weakened by disease. The trails Wes walked every day had become obstacle courses of fallen branches and muddy sinkholes. On the morning of the 4th day, the rain finally stopped. Wes stood on his porch, surveying the damage. The forest looked different now, rearranged by forces beyond anyone's control. He thought about staying home, about working in the shop instead, but his legs needed the movement, and his mind needed the quiet that only the woods could provide. He grabbed Lloyd's walking stick from beside the door and set out. The main trail was worse than he'd expected. A massive oak had fallen across the path about a quarter-mile in, forcing Wes to navigate around it through dense underbrush. His boots sank into the mud with each step, making sucking sounds as he pulled them free. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves, that particular scent of autumn giving way to the coming cold. Wes had been walking these woods for 15 years. He knew every turn, every landmark, every place where the sun hit just right in the afternoon. The familiarity was comforting in a world that kept changing in ways he couldn't control. Out here, he didn't have to think about empty houses or unfinished rocking chairs, or the fact that his phone could go days without ringing. The creek was still running high, though not as violently as during the storm. Wes could hear it before he saw it, the rushing water creating a constant background noise that masked the usual forest sounds. He normally crossed at a shallow point upstream, but today he decided to follow the bank downstream to see how much damage the flooding had caused. That's when he heard it. At first, Wes thought it might be a bird, some kind of distress call. But as he got closer, the sound resolved into something more desperate. Whimpering. Low and panicked, coming from somewhere near the water. Wes quickened his pace, using the walking stick to keep his balance on the slippery bank. The sound grew louder as Wes rounded a bend in the creek. Splashing now, mixed with those desperate whimpers, the kind of sound that spoke of pure terror and exhaustion. He scrambled down the muddy embankment, his boots sliding on the slick clay, one hand gripping Lloyd's walking stick to keep from falling. That's when he saw it. A large dog-shepherd mix by the look of it, maybe some retriever in there too, was trapped in the middle of the swollen creek. A massive log, probably 8 feet long and thick as a man's torso, had fallen across the water and pinned the animal's hind leg against a submerged rock. The dog's head was barely above water, its front legs scrabbling uselessly against the current, brown eyes wide with fear. The dog saw Wes, and the whimpering intensified, almost pleading. "Easy now," Wes called out, though his voice was lost in the rush of water. "I'm coming." He didn't stop to think about the cold or the danger, or the fact that he was 60 years old with a bad knee. He just dropped the walking stick on the bank and waded into the creek. The water hit him like a physical blow. It was shockingly cold, snowmelt from upstream mixed with the October rain. Within seconds, Wes lost feeling in his feet. The current pulled at his legs, trying to sweep him downstream, but he kept his balance and pushed forward. The dog thrashed harder as Wes approached, panic overriding everything else. "Easy, easy," Wes said again, keeping his voice low and steady despite his chattering teeth. "I'm here to help you, not hurt you." Up close, he could see the situation more clearly. The log had the dog's right hind leg completely pinned. The animal had probably been struggling for hours, maybe since the storm. Its fur was matted and muddy, and Wes could see scratches along its shoulders where it had fought against the wood. Around its neck was a frayed red collar, faded and worn, with no tags attached. Wes positioned himself upstream from the log, bracing his boots against the rocky creek bed. The water came up to his thighs now, soaking through his jeans and making every movement harder. He wrapped both arms around the log and pulled. Nothing. The wood was waterlogged and heavy, wedged firmly between rocks. Wes adjusted his grip, planted his feet more solidly, and tried again. His shoulders screamed in protest. Muscles that hadn't done this kind of work in months suddenly asked to move something that probably weighed 200 pounds. The log shifted slightly. The dog yelped, whether from pain or hope, Wes couldn't tell, and he immediately eased off. I know, he said, breathing hard. One more time, just one more. He thought about Lloyd then, about all the times his brother had talked him through impossible tasks. Lloyd's voice in his head, "You're stronger than you think, Wes. You just have to decide you're going to do it." Wes took a deep breath, bent his knees, and pulled with everything he had. His back protested, his arms shook, the cold water made his muscles sluggish and unresponsive. But slowly, inch by terrible inch, the log began to move. He shifted his weight, using his body as a lever, pushing with his legs while pulling with his arms. The log rolled. The dog's leg came free. The animal immediately tried to swim, but its injured leg couldn't support any weight. It floundered, head dipping underwater, and Wes lunged forward to grab it. His hands found purchase in the wet fur, and he hauled the dog against his chest. It was heavy, maybe 70 pounds, and Wes nearly lost his footing in the current. But he held on, adjusting his grip, getting one arm under the dog's chest and the other supporting its hindquarters. The animal went still against him, either too exhausted to fight or recognizing that Wes was trying to save it. Getting back to shore was harder than getting out to the log. Every step was a battle against the current and the weight in his arms. Wes's bad knee threatened to give out twice, but he kept moving, kept pushing forward. His breath came in ragged gasps that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with the effort. Finally, his boots found the muddy bank. He staggered up the slope, nearly falling once, and made it to flat ground before his legs gave out completely. He sank to his knees in the mud, still cradling the dog, both of them shaking from cold and shock and relief. The dog's eyes were closed now, its breathing shallow but steady. Wes could feel its heart hammering against his arm, rapid and terrified but strong. "You're okay," Wes said, not sure if he was talking to the dog or himself. "You're going to be okay." He stayed there for a moment, catching his breath, letting his heart rate slow. His clothes were completely soaked, and he knew he needed to get home before hypothermia became a real concern. But first he had to figure out how to carry a 70-pound dog through a quarter-mile of forest with a walking stick he'd left somewhere behind him. Wes looked down at the animal in his arms. Now that they were out of immediate danger, he could see more details. Male, probably 3 or 4 years old, with the intelligent eyes and strong build of a working breed. The red collar was old and frayed, held together with what looked like twisted wire where the buckle had broken. No tags, no identification, nothing to say where this dog had come from or who it belonged to. "Where's your family?" Wes asked quietly. The dog's eyes flickered open, deep brown, still frightened, but watching Wes with something that might have been trust. Wes made his decision. He shifted his grip, getting the dog positioned more securely in his arms, and stood up. His knee protested loudly, and his back wasn't happy about the situation either, but he ignored both. He'd carried heavier loads on job sites, and this dog needed help. The walk back was slow and difficult. Wes had to stop several times to rest, lowering the dog carefully to the ground while he caught his breath. Each time, the animal stayed close, leaning against Wes's leg, its injured hind leg held slightly off the ground. By the time they reached the cabin, Wes was exhausted and shivering so hard his teeth rattled. But the dog was alive, and somehow that felt like it mattered more than anything had mattered in a long time. He carried the animal through the back door and into his workshop, where there was space and warmth and soft light from the windows. He grabbed an old tarp from the corner and spread it on the floor, then gently lowered the dog onto it. Wes stood there, dripping on his workshop floor, watching the dog settle onto the tarp with a soft groan. The animal was shaking, whether from cold, pain, or fear, probably all three. Its eyes followed Wes's every movement, alert but not aggressive, waiting to see what would happen next. "Let me get you something warm," Wes said, his own voice shaking from the cold. He went into the house, peeling off his soaked jacket and boots as he moved. In the linen closet, he found what he was looking for, a quilted blanket that Catherine had made years ago. Blue and white squares, carefully stitched together during the winter she was sick, when her hands could still manage the needle. Wes had kept it folded on a high shelf, unable to use it, but unable to let it go. He grabbed it now without hesitation and returned to the workshop. The dog watched as Wes approached, its body tensing slightly. But when Wes knelt down and gently draped the blanket over the shaking animal, it relaxed. Wes tucked the edges in carefully, making sure the injured leg was covered but not compressed. "There you go," he said softly. "That should help." He built a fire in the workshop's small wood stove, something he rarely did this early in the season, but both of them needed warmth, and quickly. While the fire caught and began to radiate heat, Wes changed into dry clothes and made himself a cup of coffee that he didn't drink. His hands were still shaking, and not entirely from the cold. When had he last touched another living thing? Really touched something warm and alive that needed him? He couldn't remember. By the time the workshop had warmed up, the dog had stopped shaking. Wes knelt down beside it again, moving slowly, and began a gentle examination. The right hind leg was definitely injured, swollen and tender to the touch. The dog flinched when Wes's fingers found the worst of it, but didn't snap or try to bite. There were cuts and scrapes along the shoulders and chest, probably from struggling against the log, but nothing that looked too serious. "We need to get you to a vet," Wes said, "but it's getting late now. Morning will have to do." He went into the house and returned with a bowl of water and some leftover chicken from his refrigerator. The dog's nose twitched when it smelled the food, but it didn't move toward it. Wes set both bowls within easy reach and backed away, giving the animal space. It took 5 minutes before the dog finally stretched its neck forward and lapped at the water. Slow at first, then more eagerly, drinking until the bowl was half empty. The chicken took longer, but eventually hunger won out over caution. The dog ate carefully, watching Wes the whole time. "That's good," Wes said. "You need your strength." He pulled his work stool over and sat down, keeping his distance, but staying close enough that the dog knew it wasn't alone. The workshop was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the occasional shift of the dog's body on the tarp. Outside, afternoon was sliding into evening, the October light going golden and soft. Wes found himself talking, his voice low and steady in the warm space. "I don't know where you came from, or what happened to you," he said. "But you're safe now. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." The dog's eyes were starting to close, exhaustion finally winning the battle against fear. Wes watched as the animal's breathing slowed and deepened, its body going soft under Catherine's blanket. He stayed there as darkness fell, occasionally adding wood to the fire, keeping vigil over something that needed him. It was the first time in 6 months that the silence in his chest had felt less like emptiness and more like peace. When full dark came, Wes carefully moved the dog into the house. The animal was too heavy to carry far, but with patience and gentle encouragement, it managed to limp along beside him, putting almost no weight on the injured leg. Wes settled it on a pile of blankets beside his bed, close enough that he could hear if anything changed during the night. The dog circled once, awkwardly with 3 working legs, and collapsed with a heavy sigh. Wes climbed into bed and lay there in the darkness, listening to the sound of another creature breathing in his space. It was strange and comforting all at once. He reached down, letting his hand rest near the blankets, and after a moment he felt the warm weight of the dog's head settle against his palm. He fell asleep that way, connected to something living for the first time in longer than he cared to admit. Morning came with pale sunlight through the bedroom window. Wes woke to find the dog watching him, those brown eyes calm now, almost curious. The swelling in the leg looked worse in daylight, and Wes knew he couldn't wait any longer to get professional help. He called Dr. Brennan's clinic as soon as it opened. "Wes Mallery," the receptionist said, surprised. "We haven't heard from you in a while. What can we do for you?" "I found an injured dog," Wes said. "Pulled him out of the creek yesterday. He needs to be looked at." "Bring him in. Dr. Brennan has an opening at 10. But when Wes tried to get the dog into his truck, the animal balked. It would walk beside him, would even climb the porch steps with encouragement. But the truck was a bridge too far. Finally, Wes called the clinic back. "I can't get him in the vehicle," he admitted. "Is there any way the doctor could come here?" There was a pause, then, "Let me ask him." 5 minutes later, the receptionist called back. "Dr. Brennan says he'll stop by on his lunch break, around noon." Wes spent the morning keeping the dog comfortable and trying not to think too hard about what he was doing. This was temporary, he told himself, just until they found the owner. Someone was probably looking for this animal right now, worried sick about where it had gone. But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that the collar had been old and broken, that no one had come looking yet, that maybe this dog had been on its own for longer than just one storm. Dr. Brennan arrived exactly at noon, carrying his medical bag and wearing a kind expression that immediately put both Wes and the dog at ease. "So," he said, kneeling down beside the animal, "who do we have here?" "Don't know," Wes said. "Found him trapped in the creek during yesterday's walk. No tags on the collar." Dr. Brennan worked with gentle, practiced hands, running them over the dog's body while speaking in a low, soothing voice. The animal remained calm, seeming to understand that this human meant no harm. Wes stood nearby, surprised by the tension in his own shoulders, by how much he cared about what the doctor would say. "He's a good-looking boy, Doctor," Brennan said, checking the dog's teeth and gums. "I'd say about 4 years old, maybe a little older. Shepherd and retriever mix, definitely. Well-muscled, good bone structure. He was well cared for at some point." "At some point," Wes repeated, catching the past tense. The doctor nodded. Moving to examine the injured leg, the dog flinched but held still. "The leg's badly bruised, and there's a minor fracture here in the lower bone. Nothing that won't heal with rest and time. He'll need to stay off it as much as possible for the next few weeks. I'll give you pain medication and anti-inflammatories. No permanent damage? Shouldn't be." He got lucky. Another few hours in that water, and we'd be having a different conversation. "Doctor," Brennan looked up at Wes. "You did good, pulling him out when you did." Wes nodded, not trusting his voice. The doctor pulled out a handheld scanner and ran it over the dog's neck and shoulders. "No microchip," he said after a moment. "That collar suggests he belonged to someone, but without tags or a chip, there's no easy way to find out who. What should I do?" "Well, legally, you need to report him as found, post notices around town, call the shelters, that sort of thing. If no one claims him within a reasonable time, usually 30 days around here, then you can consider him yours if you want to keep him." Dr. Brennan cleaned and bandaged the cuts, administered a painkiller, and left Wes with instructions and medication. As he was packing up his bag, he paused and looked at Wes with an expression that was hard to read. "I have to say, Wes, you seem different today." "Different how?" "More present, I guess. Like you're actually here instead of just going through the motions." The doctor smiled. "It's good to see." After he left, Wes sat on the porch steps with the dog lying beside him. The animal's head rested on Wes's thigh, a comfortable weight that felt right somehow. Wes ran his hand over the soft fur. feeling the steady rise and fall of breath beneath his palm. "I guess I should try to find your people," he said quietly. The dog's tail thumped once against the boards. Over the next 2 weeks, Wes did what he was supposed to do. He printed found dog flyers and posted them at the grocery store, the feed shop, the post office. He called every animal shelter within 50 miles, describing the dog and leaving his number. He even took out a small ad in the local newspaper. No one called. No one came looking. The dog's leg healed slowly but steadily. By the end of the first week, he was putting some weight on it. By the end of the second, he was walking with only a slight limp. Wes established a routine around the animal's needs, feeding times, short walks that gradually got longer, medication schedules. It gave shape to his days in a way that woodworking alone never had. He found himself returning to the half-finished rocking chair in the workshop. With the dog resting nearby, watching with those calm brown eyes, Wes picked up his tools again. The familiar motions came back slowly, measuring, cutting, sanding, fitting pieces together. He worked while the dog slept, and when the dog woke, they'd go outside together. Phyllis noticed the change immediately. She came by one afternoon with a casserole and stopped dead on the porch when she saw the dog. "Wes Mallery," she said, eyes wide. "Is that a dog?" "Found him in the creek after the storm. He was trapped." Phyllis set down the casserole and knelt, offering her hand for the dog to sniff. He accepted her attention graciously, tail wagging. "He's beautiful. Are you keeping him?" "Just until I find the owner." "Mm-hmm." Phyllis's tone suggested she didn't quite believe that. She stood up and looked at Wes carefully. "You know what, Wes? This place feels different. Lighter, somehow." "It's just a dog, Phyllis." "Maybe. But you're smiling. I haven't seen you smile in 6 months." Wes touched his face, surprised to find that she was right. The walks became Wes's favorite part of the day. He and the dog, he still called him Dog, unable to commit to a real name, would head out in the early morning when the air was cool and the light was soft. They'd take the familiar trails, moving slower now to accommodate the healing leg, but covering good ground nonetheless. The dog stayed close, never ranging too far, always circling back to check on Wes. It reminded him of Lloyd, actually the way his brother used to look out for him even when they were kids, always making sure Wes was okay before pushing forward with whatever adventure he'd planned. One morning they returned to the creek where it had all started. The water had receded to its normal levels, and the log that had trapped the dog was visible now, wedged between rocks. Wes stood looking at it, marveling at how heavy it was, how he'd managed to move it at all. The dog sat beside him, looking at the log too, as if he understood the significance of this place. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" Wes said. "Both of us stuck, both of us needing a hand up." The dog leaned against his leg, warm and solid and real. Dr. Brennan came by for a follow-up visit 2 weeks after the rescue. He examined the leg, declared it healing beautifully, and gave Wes permission to gradually increase the length and difficulty of their walks. "Has anyone claimed him?" the doctor asked. "No, not a single call." "Are you disappointed or relieved?" Wes considered the question honestly. "I don't know. Maybe both." "Well, you've got another 2 weeks before the waiting period is officially up. But between you and me, Wes, I don't think anyone's coming for him. That collar was old, months old, maybe longer. My guess is he's been on his own for a while." After the doctor left, Wes sat in his workshop with the dog and thought about what that meant. Abandoned, left behind, forced to survive alone through who knew how many storms and cold nights. He understood that feeling better than he wanted to admit. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun go down, Wes made a decision. He reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, feeling the animal lean into the touch with obvious pleasure. "You need a proper name," Wes said. "Can't keep calling you Dog forever." The name came to him 3 days later while he was working in the shop. He'd been sanding the curved arm of the rocking chair, Lloyd's rocking chair, letting his mind wander while his hands did familiar work. The dog was asleep in a patch of sunlight near the window, snoring softly, completely at peace. Wes found himself thinking about his grandfather, a man he'd barely known, but whose presence had loomed large in family stories. Grover Mallery had been a carpenter too, had taught Wes's father the trade, had believed in honest work and treating people with dignity. Lloyd used to say that Wes had inherited Grover's steady hands and patient nature. "Grover," Wes said aloud, testing the sound. The dog's ears perked up, his eyes opened, and he lifted his head, looking directly at Wes. "Grover," Wes said again, and the dog's tail began to wag. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe the dog was just responding to Wes's tone. But it felt right in a way that settled something in Wes's chest. "All right then," he said. "Grover it is." The dog Grover stood up and walked over, pressing his head against Wes's knee. Wes set down the sandpaper and ran both hands over the animal's head, scratching the spots that made Grover's back leg thump in contentment. "Welcome home," Wes said quietly. The month that followed brought changes Wes hadn't anticipated. With Grover's leg fully healed, their walks grew longer and more adventurous. They explored trails Wes hadn't walked in years, ventured into parts of the forest he'd forgotten existed. Grover would range ahead, nose to the ground, then circle back to make sure Wes was keeping up. There was joy in it, pure, uncomplicated joy that Wes had thought he'd lost the capacity for. People in town started noticing the difference. Wes found himself stopping to talk when he went in for supplies, instead of rushing through his errands and heading straight home. The hardware store owner asked about the dog. The woman at the post office commented on how well-trained Grover was. Even the teenager who bagged groceries wanted to know where Wes had gotten him. "Found him," Wes would say, and then he'd tell the story. The storm, the creek, the trapped animal. Each time he told it, he felt a little less alone. Phyllis invited him to a church social one Sunday afternoon. Wes's first instinct was to decline. He'd been avoiding social gatherings since Lloyd died, but something made him pause. "Can I bring Grover?" "Of course," Phyllis said, delighted. Everyone would love to meet him. So Wes found himself at the church fellowship hall on a sunny October afternoon, Grover on a leash beside him, surrounded by people he'd known his whole life but had been avoiding for months. They welcomed him back like he'd never left, and if they noticed he'd been absent, they were kind enough not to mention it. Grover was a hit. Children clustered around him, and he accepted their attention with patient dignity. Adults asked questions, and Wes found himself actually enjoying the conversations, the simple act of being part of something again. It was during one of these conversations that the memories hit him hardest. An older man named Frank was asking about Wes's carpentry work, and somehow the talk turned to Lloyd. Frank had known both brothers, had hired them for projects over the years. "Lloyd was always the charmer," Frank said with a warm smile. "But you were the one who made sure everything was done right. Good team, you two." Wes nodded, throat suddenly tight. "I was real sorry to hear about the accident," Frank continued. "He was a good man." The accident. Wes hadn't talked about it with anyone except Phyllis, and even with her, he'd kept most of it inside. But standing there in the fellowship hall with Grover leaning against his leg, the words started coming. "He was driving home from a job," Wes said quietly. "Some kid ran a red light, texting on his phone. Lloyd didn't even see it coming." "Were you there?" "No. I was supposed to meet him that afternoon. We were going to work on a project together." Wes paused. "I got the call from the hospital instead." The guilt that followed him everywhere rose up fresh. He should have been there, should have driven Lloyd home, should have insisted they work together that day instead of separately. All the should-haves that didn't change anything but lived in his chest like stones. Grover pressed closer against his leg, as if sensing the shift in Wes's emotions. Wes reached down and rested his hand on the dog's head, grounding himself in the warmth and weight of something alive and present. "I'm glad you've got the dog now," Frank said. "Companionship helps." After the social, Phyllis walked with Wes back to his truck. "You did good today," she said. "I know that wasn't easy." "No," Wes admitted, "but it wasn't as hard as I thought it'd be. That's Grover's doing. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just tired of being alone with it all." Phyllis squeezed his arm. "Either way, you're coming back to life. Your brother would be happy to see it." That evening, Wes sat in his workshop with Grover at his feet and pulled out a drawer he hadn't opened in months. Inside was a brass compass that had belonged to Lloyd, their grandfather's compass actually, passed down through the family. Lloyd had carried it on every job site, said it kept him oriented no matter where he was. Wes turned the compass over in his hands, watching the needles swing and settle. North, always north. Steady and true. Lloyd had tried to get Wes to adopt a dog years ago, back when Catherine was still alive. "You need something to take care of besides furniture," Lloyd had said. "Something that'll get you out of your head." Wes had refused then, said he was too busy, didn't have time for the responsibility. Now, he wondered if Lloyd had seen something in him, even back then, some tendency toward isolation that needed countering. "You were right," Wes said aloud, though Lloyd wasn't there to hear it. "I did need this." Grover lifted his head, ears perked. "Not you specifically," Wes clarified, reaching down to scratch behind those ears. "But yes, also you." The rocking chair was nearly finished now. Wes had been working on it steadily for the past 2 weeks, and the project that had seemed impossible after Lloyd's death was now taking shape. Smooth curves, careful joints, the kind of work that required patience and attention, the kind of work that made sense. He'd started thinking about other projects too, a proper doghouse for Grover, a new set of bookshelves for the living room, maybe even taking on some commissions again. Winter arrived gradually, the way it always did in this part of the country. The October gold gave way to November grey, and then one morning Wes woke to find the world covered in a thin blanket of white. First snow, earlier than usual, coating the trees and the roof and the truck parked outside. Grover stood at the window, nose pressed against the glass, tail wagging with excitement. "You like snow?" Wes asked, pulling on his boots. The answer became clear the moment he opened the door. Grover bounded out into the white world like a puppy, leaping and spinning, snapping at snowflakes. His joy was so pure and uncomplicated that Wes found himself laughing, really laughing, the sound surprising him with its unfamiliarity. They walked through the transformed forest, their boots and paws leaving the first tracks in the fresh snow. Everything looked different, cleaner somehow, like the world had been given a chance to start over. Wes thought about beginnings, about second chances, about how sometimes life gives you exactly what you need when you least expect it. The church social had opened a door, and Wes found himself stepping through it more often. When Phyllis invited him to join a weekly coffee group at the local diner, he said yes. Every Thursday morning, a handful of folks would gather in the back booth, mostly men his age or older, retired or semi-retired, looking for conversation and connection. Wes brought Grover the first time, uncertain of the reception, but the dog settled quietly under the table, and within minutes it was like they'd always been part of the group. The talk ranged from politics to fishing to the best way to winterize a waterline. Simple things, everyday things, but Wes realized he'd been starving for exactly this kind of ordinary human contact. One of the regulars, a man named Frank Kowalski, who owned the feed store, asked about Wes's carpentry work. "Heard you used to do beautiful custom pieces," Frank said. "You still taking commissions?" "Hadn't planned on it," Wes admitted. "Been kind of out of the work for a while." "Well, if you change your mind, my daughter's getting married next spring. She's been looking for someone to build a special hope chest, something that'll last, you know? Not the particle board stuff from the big stores." Wes found himself nodding. "I could do that. Have her call me." The words surprised him even as he said them. But why not? He had the skills, the tools, the time, and working for someone else, creating something meaningful, suddenly seemed like exactly what he needed. More commissions followed. Word spread the way it does in small towns. Wes Mallery was taking orders again. A jewelry box for a 50th anniversary, a toy chest for a new grandchild, a dining table to replace one that had finally given out after 40 years of use. Wes worked in his shop with Grover always nearby, and the hours passed in a kind of meditation. The rhythm of planning, measuring, cutting, assembling, it was like learning to speak a language he'd thought he'd forgotten. His hands remembered what his mind had tried to put away. Dr. Brennan stopped by one afternoon, ostensibly to check on Grover, but really, Wes suspected, to check on him. "He looks great," the doctor said, running his hands over Grover's shoulders and legs. "You've taken good care of him." "He's taken good care of me too," Wes said, and meant it. They ended up having coffee on the porch, watching the winter afternoon fade toward evening. Dr. Brennan talked about his practice, about the challenges of being the only vet in a rural area, about the satisfaction of helping animals. Wes found himself sharing more than he'd intended about Lloyd, about the long months of grief, about how Grover had somehow pulled him back from a darkness he hadn't fully recognized until he was out of it. "Animals have a way of doing that," Dr. Brennan said. "They need us, which means we have to show up. Can't just disappear into our own heads when there's a dog that needs feeding and walking and attention." "Is that your professional opinion?" "That's my personal experience. Lost my dad 2 years ago, got a cat right after, completely by accident. Found her in a parking lot, couldn't leave her there. She probably saved my life, in her own way." The conversation shifted to easier topics after that, but something had changed. Wes realized he'd made a friend, a real friend, not just an acquaintance. The thought was both comforting and slightly terrifying. The coffee group became a fixture in his week. So did the carpentry commissions. So did the regular walks with Grover. Longer now, more adventurous. They ranged farther into the forest, discovering frozen streams and snow-covered meadows, leaving tracks that would be covered by the next snowfall. One evening, at Dr. Brennan's suggestion, Wes started keeping a journal. It felt awkward at first. He'd never been much for writing, but once he started, the words came easier than expected. He wrote about his days with Grover, about the projects in his shop, about memories of Lloyd and Catherine. He wrote about grief and healing, about loneliness and connection, about how strange it was to feel like himself again after so long feeling like a ghost. The journal became a place to process things he couldn't say aloud. The guilt about Lloyd's death, the fear that he'd somehow failed his brother by not being there, the complicated relief of finding something to live for again, and the shame that came with that relief, as if moving forward meant leaving Lloyd behind. But Grover was there through all of it, a steady presence that demanded nothing and gave everything. On the nights when the memories were too heavy, when Wes lay awake staring at the ceiling, Grover would climb up onto the bed, something Wes had tried to discourage at first, but had given up on, and rest his head on Wes's chest. The weight was comforting, grounding, a reminder that he wasn't alone. Phyllis noticed the changes first. "You're different now," she said one afternoon when she stopped by with cookies. "Lighter somehow. More like yourself." "I wasn't myself before." "You were going through the motions. Now you're actually living again." Wes thought about that later, sitting in his workshop with Grover asleep at his feet and the completed rocking chair in front of him. Lloyd's chair. The project he'd abandoned when grief made everything impossible. He'd finished it now, working slowly and carefully, putting all his skill into every joint and curve. It was beautiful, maybe the best piece he'd ever made. And looking at it, Wes realized Phyllis was right. He was living again, not just surviving. The difference was subtle but profound. He reached down and rested his hand on Grover's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of breath. This dog had saved him, though not in the dramatic way of the creek rescue. Grover had saved him in the daily, ordinary ways that mattered most, by needing him, by being present, by offering uncomplicated love and companionship. "Thank you," Wes said quietly, though Grover was asleep and couldn't hear. "For everything." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, covering the world in white. Inside the workshop, it was warm and peaceful, filled with the smell of wood and the quiet breathing of a dog. Wes picked up his journal and began to write, documenting this moment, this feeling, this unexpected second chance at life. He wrote about rescue, how sometimes the one being saved and the one doing the saving were the same person. How Grover had been trapped under that log, but Wes had been trapped too, under the weight of grief and isolation. How they'd freed each other without even knowing it. The envelope fell out during Grover's bath on a cold January afternoon. Wes had been washing the dog in the mudroom. Grover had found something dead in the woods and rolled in it with evident pleasure when he noticed the collar was coming loose. The worn red fabric had finally given up, the twisted wire that held it together starting to unravel. "Hold still," Wes said, working to unfasten it. "Let's get you a proper collar after this." As he pulled the old collar free, something small and white slipped from inside the fabric lining and fluttered to the floor. An envelope, carefully sealed in a plastic bag that had kept it dry through months of weather. Wes's hands went still. Grover shook, spraying water everywhere, but Wes barely noticed. He picked up the bag, his heart suddenly beating faster, and carefully opened it. The envelope inside was small, the kind that might come with a greeting card. On the front, in careful child's handwriting, it said, "To whoever finds my dog." Wes sat down on the mudroom floor, wet dog and all, and opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a child's drawing crayon on construction paper, the colors bright and hopeful. A family. A tall man, a small girl with pigtails, and a large brown dog. They were holding hands and smiling, standing in front of a house with a red door. At the top, in that same careful handwriting, "My family." And beneath the drawing, a note. "Dear person," it began, "my name is Annie, and I am 7 years old. This is my dog, Grover. We had to give him away because we lost our house and have nowhere to live. My daddy says we can't keep him because we don't have money for food and we're living in our car. I love Grover so much. He has been my dog since I was 4. Please take care of him. His favorite food is chicken, and he likes to sleep by the bed. He is a very good dog. He likes to play fetch, and he knows how to sit and shake. Please be nice to him, and don't let him be scared. I miss him every day. Love, Annie. P.S. His birthday is in April. He will be 5. Wes read the note 3 times, each word landing like a physical blow. The date at the top was from last March, nearly 10 months ago. This child had lost her dog almost a year ago, had carefully hidden this note in his collar, hoping someone would find him and care for him. And someone had. But now Wes understood what he'd taken in. Not an abandoned animal, but a beloved pet that a family had been forced to give up. Somewhere out there, a little girl named Annie was still missing her dog. Grover pressed against him, wet and smelling of dog shampoo, sensing Wes's distress. Wes wrapped his arms around the dog, around Grover, and tried to process what this meant. He'd named the dog after his grandfather, had built a life around him, had found purpose and connection through caring for him. Grover had saved him from drowning in grief, had given him a reason to get up in the morning, had brought him back to life. But Grover wasn't his, had never been his, belonged to a 7-year-old girl who'd had to make an impossible choice. Wes looked at the drawing again, at the simple joy captured in crayon strokes. A family that loved their dog. A child who'd written this note with such care, such hope that someone good would find him. God, Wes said quietly, his voice breaking. He spent the rest of the afternoon in a kind of daze. He dried Grover, put a new collar on him, moved through the familiar motions while his mind spun in circles. Part of him wanted to pretend he'd never found the note, to put it away and forget about it. Grover was his now. He'd cared for him, loved him, needed him. But another part, the part that Lloyd would have been proud of, knew what he had to do. That evening, Wes called Dr. Brennan. "I found something," he said, his voice rough. "In Grover's old collar, a note from a child." He read it over the phone, and when he finished, There was a long silence. "Oh, Wes," Dr. Brennan said finally. "I'm so sorry. What do I do? What do you want to do?" Wes looked across the room at Grover, who was lying by the fireplace, completely at ease in what he'd come to know as home. "I want to keep him. I want to pretend I never found this note. I want to be selfish. But there's a little girl out there who lost her dog through no fault of her own, who's been missing him for 10 months, who carefully wrote that note hoping he'd be okay. You're a good man, Wes." "I don't feel like a good man. I feel like someone whose heart is about to break all over again." Dr. Brennan was quiet for a moment. "You know, doing the right thing doesn't make it hurt less, but it does make it mean something." After they hung up, Wes sat with the note for a long time. He thought about Lloyd, about what his brother would say. Lloyd had always been the one who did the right thing, even when it cost him. Lloyd would have already started looking for this family. The next morning, Wes began his search. He contacted family services, explained the situation, asked about families who'd been homeless last spring. The social worker he spoke with was sympathetic, but cautious about privacy. "I can't give out information about clients," she said, "but if you give me your contact information, I can reach out to families that might match and have them contact you." It took 3 days. 3 days of Wes going through normal motions while feeling like he was standing at the edge of a cliff. 3 days of looking at Grover and seeing both the life they'd built together and the life that dog had left behind. On the 4th day, his phone rang. "Is this Wes Mallery?" The voice was male, tentative, heavy with hope and fear. "The social worker said you found a dog, a brown shepherd mix." Wes's throat went tight. "Yes." "With a red collar? About 4 years old?" "Yes." There was a sound on the other end, something between a laugh and a sob. "His name is Grover. My daughter named him after a character from Sesame Street. We had to give him up last March when we lost our apartment. I've been looking for him ever since, but I didn't know where to start." "Oh God, is he okay? Is he safe?" "He's safe," Wes managed. "He's been with me since October. He's healthy and well cared for." "Thank you," the man's voice cracked. "Thank you so much. You don't know what this means. My daughter Annie, she's been heartbroken. We've been in transitional housing for 2 months now, and they allow pets. We've been trying to find him but had no idea where to look. Would it be possible to see him?" Wes closed his eyes. Grover was lying at his feet, chin resting on Wes's boot, trusting and content. "Yes," he said, though the word felt like giving up everything. "Yes, you can see him." They arranged to meet at the community center in town the following Saturday. "Neutral ground," the social worker suggested, to make the transition easier for everyone. Wes hung up and sat in silence. The days leading up to Saturday moved both too fast and too slow. Wes found himself memorizing everything about Grover, the way he tilted his head when Wes spoke, the specific rhythm of his tail wag, the warm weight of him pressed against Wes's leg during their evening sits on the porch. All the small details that had become the framework of his daily life. Phyllis came by on Wednesday and found Wes in the workshop, staring at a half-finished project without really seeing it. "You're doing the right thing," she said, not needing him to explain what was wrong. The whole town knew by now, small towns being what they were. "Then why does it feel so wrong?" "Because love always costs something. That's how you know it's real." She sat down on the work stool beside him. "You could keep him, you know. Legally, you probably have a case. You found him, cared for him, posted notices." "I could," Wes agreed. "But every time I looked at him, I'd see that little girl's drawing. I'd know I'd taken something from a child who'd already lost so much. Lloyd would be proud of you." Wes's throat tightened. "Lloyd would probably tell me I'm an idiot, that I should keep the dog and be happy." "No," Phyllis said firmly. "Lloyd would tell you that doing the hard right thing is better than the easy wrong thing. He'd tell you that's what makes you the better man between you two." After she left, Wes pulled out supplies and began putting together a care package. Grover's favorite toys, the rope he loved to tug, the tennis ball that was his prized possession, the stuffed duck that squeaked, the bag of food he preferred, his medications and medical records, everything that would help him transition back to his original family. Dr. Brennan stopped by on Thursday evening with a folder of Grover's complete medical history. "I included everything," he said, "the initial examination, the x-rays of his leg, vaccination updates, all of it. This family needs to know he's been well cared for." They sat on the porch together, Grover between them, and watched the winter sun set behind the bare trees. "How are you holding up?" Dr. Brennan asked. "I keep telling myself this is temporary, that Grover was always meant to pass through my life, not stay in it, that he served his purpose, pulled me out of the dark place I was in." Wes paused. "Doesn't make it easier." "No, it wouldn't. But Wes, look at what you've built in these few months. The coffee group, the carpentry commissions, the connections with people. Grover started that. But you're the one who kept it going. He didn't make you a different person, he reminded you who you already were." Friday night, Wes couldn't sleep. He lay in bed with Grover curled up beside him on the bed, where Wes had finally given up trying to keep him off, and ran his hand over the soft fur. "I need you to know something," Wes said quietly into the darkness. "These months with you have been a gift. You saved my life, even if you didn't know you were doing it. And tomorrow, when I take you back to your real family, it's going to break my heart. But it's the right thing to do." Grover shifted, pressing closer, and Wes felt tears sliding down his temples into his hair. "I hope you'll be happy," he continued. "I hope that little girl loves you the way you deserve. I hope you remember these months with me, at least a little. And I hope," his voice broke, "I hope you know that letting you go is the hardest thing I've done since losing my brother." He didn't sleep much that night. Instead, he lay there feeling Grover's warmth, listening to his breathing, trying to memorize the sound and weight and presence of this animal who'd become his companion, his purpose, his friend. Saturday morning arrived too soon. Wes fed Grover his breakfast, watching him eat with the enthusiasm that had always made Wes smile. They took one last walk through the woods, following their usual trail to the creek where everything had started. The water was partially frozen now, ice along the edges, the log that had trapped Grover covered in snow. Wes stood looking at it for a long time. "This is where we met," he told Grover. "Right here. You were scared and hurt, and I was lost in a different way. We saved each other that day." Grover sat beside him, looking up with those intelligent brown eyes, and Wes knelt down to wrap his arms around the dog's neck. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." Back at the cabin, Wes loaded the care package into his truck: toys, food, medical records, and one more thing. He'd spent the previous evening carving a wooden dog tag, something more permanent than the store-bought metal ones. He'd engraved it carefully, Grover on one side, and on the other, loved and protected. He tucked it into the package. He'd also written a letter to Annie. It had taken him 3 tries to get the words right. "Dear Annie," it read, "my name is Wes, and I'm the person who found your dog. I want you to know that Grover has been safe and happy and very well cared for. He's a wonderful dog, smart and loyal and gentle. You should be very proud of him. I know how hard it must have been to let him go, and I want you to know that your note in his collar meant everything to me. It told me exactly what kind of love Grover came from, and what kind of love he deserved to return to. He's been my friend and companion these past months, and taking care of him has been an honor. I'm so glad he's going back to you, where he belongs. Please give him extra chicken for me, and throw the tennis ball as often as he wants. He's earned it. Your friend, Wes." He'd included several photographs too: Grover in the snow, Grover in the workshop, Grover on the porch at sunset. Proof that these months had been real, that this time had mattered. The drive to town felt too short. Wes kept glancing over at Grover in the passenger seat, the dog sitting alert and happy, no idea that everything was about to change. They pulled into the community center parking lot 15 minutes early. A social worker Wes recognized met him at the door. "The family's inside," she said gently. "Are you ready?" Wes looked down at Grover, at the trust in those brown eyes, and felt his heart crack wide open. "No," he said honestly, "but let's do this anyway." He gathered the care package, clipped a leash onto Grover's new collar, and walked toward the community center entrance. Each step felt impossible and necessary all at once. Through the glass doors, he could see them, a tall man, maybe 40, and a small girl with dark braids, both standing with an intensity that spoke of hope barely contained. The moment Annie saw Grover through the glass, her face transformed. Pure joy, disbelief, love, all of it written clearly in her expression. She pressed her hands against the door, tears already streaming down her face. And Grover's whole body went rigid, his ears perked forward. A sound came from his throat, something between a whine and a bark of recognition. Wes opened the door, and everything happened at once. Annie rushed forward, dropping to her knees, and Grover lunged toward her with a force that nearly pulled the leash from Wes's hand. The dog was making sounds Wes had never heard from him, joyful whines and excited barks, his entire body wiggling with an emotion so pure it was almost painful to witness. "Grover!" Annie's voice broke on the word. "Grover, you're here, you're really here." The dog was all over her, licking her face, pressing against her, his tail wagging so hard his whole back end moved with it. Annie wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face in his fur, sobbing and laughing at the same time. "I missed you so much," she said between tears. "I missed you every single day. I'm so sorry we had to leave you." The man, Annie's father, stood a few feet back, tears running down his face, one hand pressed over his mouth. He looked at Wes with an expression of gratitude so profound that Wes had to look away. Wes stood there holding the leash, watching this reunion, and felt his own heart breaking and mending simultaneously. This was right. Painful, but right. Grover belonged here, with this child who'd loved him first, who'd carefully written that note hoping he'd be safe. Finally, Annie looked up at Wes, her face wet with tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice small and thick with emotion. "Thank you for taking care of him." Wes knelt down so he was at her level. "You're welcome, Annie. He's a very special dog. You should know he's been happy and healthy, and he's been very loved." "I love him so much," Annie said, fresh tears spilling over. "When we had to leave him, it was the worst day of my whole life. Daddy said we didn't have a choice, but I prayed every night that someone good would find him." "Someone good did find him," Annie's father said, his voice rough. He stepped forward and extended his hand to Wes. "I'm Irving Moss. I don't have words for what this means to us." Wes shook his hand, feeling the genuine strength in Irving's grip. "Wes Mallery. The social worker told me how you found him." "Trapped in the creek?" "Yes, back in October after a storm. His leg was pinned under a log." Wes glanced down at Grover, who was pressed against Annie like he might disappear if he moved away. "He was in bad shape, but he healed up fine. Strong dog." Irving's eyes were wet. "We lost our apartment last March. I lost my job, got behind on rent, and they evicted us. We were living in my car for 2 months before we could get into a shelter. The shelter didn't allow pets, and I couldn't—" His voice broke. "I couldn't keep feeding him when I could barely feed Annie. So I drove him out to a wooded area and I let him go. It's the worst thing I've ever done in my life." "Daddy," Annie said softly, looking up at him, "you didn't have a choice." "I had a choice. I just didn't have any good ones." Irving looked at Wes. "I've been trying to find him ever since we got into transitional housing 2 months ago. But I didn't know where to start. When the social worker called and said someone had found a dog matching his description, I couldn't believe it." Wes reached down and picked up the care package he'd brought. "I put together some things for him. His favorite toys, the food he likes, his medical records. There's also a letter for Annie, and some photographs from the time he's been with me." He handed the package to Irving, who took it with shaking hands. "And there's one more thing," Wes said. He pulled the wooden dog tag from his pocket and held it out to Annie. I made this for him. Thought you might want to put it on his collar." Annie took the tag carefully, running her small fingers over the carved letters. "Loved and protected," she read aloud. Then she looked up at Wes with eyes too old for 7 years. "Did you love him?" The question hit Wes square in the chest. "Yes," he said simply. "Very much." "I'm glad," Annie said. "I'm glad he had someone to love him while we couldn't." She clipped the wooden tag onto Grover's collar, right beside the metal one that must have been his original. Then she wrapped her arms around the dog again, and Grover settled against her with a contentment that was unmistakable. Wes straightened up, and Irving stepped closer. "How can I ever repay you for this?" "You don't need to repay me." Taking care of Grover was... Wes paused, searching for words. "He came into my life when I needed him. I'd lost my brother 6 months before I found Grover. I was alone and not handling it well. Caring for him gave me a reason to get up in the morning. He saved me as much as I saved him." Irving's expression shifted to understanding. Then maybe this was meant to happen exactly the way it did. Grover needed someone to care for him, and you needed something to care for. "Maybe," Wes agreed. He looked down at Annie and Grover, at the way they fit together like pieces that had always belonged. "You have a wonderful daughter, Irving, and she has a wonderful dog. I hope you'll both be very happy together." "Would you—" Irving hesitated. "Would you want to visit sometime? I know this is hard, giving him back, and Annie would love to stay in touch with the person who kept Grover safe. Maybe we could arrange something?" Wes's first instinct was to say no, that a clean break would be easier. But looking at Annie's hopeful face, at Grover's tail still wagging, he found himself nodding. "I'd like that," he said, and meant it. Irving wrote down his phone number and address an apartment in the transitional housing complex on the east side of town. "Call any time," he said. "Seriously, any time." The moment was coming when Wes would have to walk away. He could feel it approaching like a wave, and he wasn't ready. But ready or not, it was time. He knelt down one more time, and Grover immediately came to him, pressing his head against Wes's chest. Wes wrapped his arms around the dog and closed his eyes. "Be good," he whispered. "Be happy. And thank you for everything." Grover licked his face once, and Wes had to fight to keep his composure. He stood up, handed the leash to Irving, and took a step back. "Goodbye, Grover," he said. Annie stood up and surprised him by wrapping her arms around his waist. "Thank you, Mr. Wes," she said. "You're a hero." Wes's hand found her head, resting there for just a moment. "No, sweetie, I'm just someone who did what was right." He walked out of the community center without looking back. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of Wes's life. The truck felt cavernous without Grover in the passenger seat, without the warm presence that had become as familiar as breathing. Wes kept his eyes on the road and his hands steady on the wheel, but inside he felt like something essential had been carved out of him. When he pulled into his driveway, Phyllis was sitting on his porch steps. She stood as he got out of the truck, took one look at his face, and opened her arms. Wes walked into her embrace and let himself break, just for a moment, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs he'd held back during the entire drive. "I know," Phyllis said quietly, holding him the way a mother holds a hurting child. "I know it's hard." After a minute, Wes pulled himself together and stepped back. "I'm all right." "No, you're not. But you will be." She squeezed his arm. "Come on, I brought soup." They sat at his kitchen table, and Phyllis ladled out chicken noodle soup that Wes couldn't quite bring himself to eat. The house felt wrong, too quiet, too empty, missing the sound of paws on the floor and the jingle of tags. "Tell me about them," Phyllis said. "The family." So Wes told her about Irving and Annie, about the reunion, about the way Grover had recognized his girl immediately and gone to her with such pure joy. "He belongs with her," Wes said. "I knew it the moment I saw them together. But God, Phyllis, I didn't expect it to hurt this much." "Of course it hurts." "You love him. Love doesn't stop just because circumstances change. Over the next few days, Wes fell back into old patterns. He skipped the Thursday coffee group, stopped working on the carpentry projects in his shop, spent hours sitting on the porch, staring at nothing, feeling the absence like a physical weight. But this time was different from after Lloyd's death. This time, Phyllis wouldn't let him disappear. She showed up on Thursday afternoon and physically dragged him to the diner. "You're coming," she said firmly. "Those men are expecting you, and you're not going to let them down." At the diner, Frank and the others welcomed him back without comment about his absence. They talked about normal things, weather, town gossip, the upcoming spring, and slowly, Wes felt himself settling back into the rhythm of conversation, of connection, of being part of something. On the drive home, Phyllis said, "See, the world you built doesn't disappear just because Grover's not in it anymore. It feels like it does." "I know. But it doesn't." A week after the reunion, an envelope arrived in Wes's mailbox. Inside was a thank you card covered in stickers and crayon drawings, dogs and hearts and stars. Annie's handwriting filled the inside. "Dear Mr. Wes," it read, "thank you for taking care of Grover. He is so happy to be home. We play fetch every day and he sleeps in my bed just like he used to. Daddy says I can write to you if I want to tell you about Grover. Would that be okay? I want you to know he's doing good. Your friend Annie. P.S. We love the wooden tag you made. It's Grover's favorite." Tucked inside was another drawing, this one showing Wes, Annie, Irving and Grover all standing together, holding hands, or paws, in Grover's case. At the top, Annie had written, "Friends." Wes sat at his kitchen table and read the card 3 times. Something in his chest loosened, just a little. He pulled out paper and a pen and wrote back. "Dear Annie," he began, "I would love to hear about Grover. Please write to me anytime you want. I'm so glad he's happy and home where he belongs. Your friend Wes." More letters came over the next 2 weeks. Annie wrote about Grover's adventures, about how he helped her with homework by sitting beside her, about the new tricks she was teaching him. Each letter included a drawing, and each one made Wes smile despite the ache in his chest. Irving called one evening. "I wanted to thank you again," he said, "and to tell you something. Seeing what you did, returning Grover, even though it cost you, it inspired me. I started volunteering at the homeless shelter where we stayed, helping other families navigate the system, find resources, trying to pay forward what you did for us. That's good, Irving, really good. Would you want to come to dinner sometime? Annie asks about you every day. And I think it would be good for Grover to see you. Good for all of us, maybe." Wes hesitated, then found himself saying yes. The following Saturday, he drove to the apartment complex on the east side of town. It was modest but clean, with a small playground out front. Irving met him at the door, and Annie came running, Grover right behind her. The dog stopped when he saw Wes, tail starting to wag. He approached cautiously, sniffed Wes's hand, and then his whole body relaxed in recognition. Grover pressed against Wes's legs, and Wes knelt down to properly greet him. "Hey, buddy," Wes said softly, running his hands over familiar fur. "You look good." "Happy." Grover licked his face, tail wagging hard, then circled back to Annie. The message was clear, he remembered. Wes was happy to see him, but his place was with his girl now. Dinner was simple but warm. Annie chattered non-stop about school and friends and Grover's antics. Irving talked about his job. He was working 2 positions, saving up for a real apartment and his volunteer work. Wes found himself relaxing, enjoying the company, feeling less like he'd lost something and more like he'd gained something different. After dinner, they all went to the small park nearby. Annie threw the tennis ball, and Grover ran after it with endless enthusiasm. Wes stood with Irving, watching, and felt something settle in his chest. "Thank you for coming," Irving said. "This means a lot to Annie. To all of us." "Thank you for inviting me," Wes replied, and he meant it. Spring came gradually to the rural Midwest, the way it always did, tentative at first, winter reluctant to release its hold, And then suddenly everywhere, all at once, the snow melted, revealing brown grass that would soon turn green. The trees began to bud. The creek ran high with runoff, and the forest came alive with birdsong. Wes stood on his porch one April morning, coffee cup in hand, and breathed in air that smelled of earth and possibility. 6 months had passed since he'd returned Grover to Annie. 6 months of adjustment, of grief, of slowly learning to live with the empty space the dog had left behind. But the space wasn't entirely empty anymore. He'd continued the Thursday coffee group, had taken on more carpentry commissions than he could reasonably handle. The rocking chair he'd made for Lloyd now sat on his porch, and sometimes he'd sit in it in the evenings, rocking slowly, thinking about his brother and feeling grateful rather than devastated. His friendship with Dr. Brennan had deepened. They went hiking together most weekends, exploring trails throughout the region. Wes had even joined the church choir at Phyllis's insistence, discovering he didn't hate singing as much as he'd thought he would. And he saw Annie, Irving, and Grover once a month. Regular visits that had become something he looked forward to, a reminder that love given freely always came back in unexpected ways. The journal he'd started during those months with Grover had become a nightly ritual. He wrote about his days, his thoughts, the slow process of healing that never really ended but got easier with time. Reading back through earlier entries, he could see his own transformation from a man drowning in isolation to someone actively engaged with life again. Dr. Brennan had been bringing it up more frequently lately, the idea of Wes adopting another dog. "The shelter has several that would be perfect for you," he'd said just last week. "Older dogs, passed over because people want puppies. They need someone exactly like you." Wes had been resistant at first. The idea of replacing Grover felt wrong, disloyal somehow. But Phyllis had set him straight with her usual bluntness. "You're not replacing him," she'd said. "You're honoring what he taught you about opening your heart. There's a difference." So on this April morning, Wes made a decision. He finished his coffee, got in his truck, and drove to the animal shelter on the edge of town. The shelter was busy with weekend visitors, families looking at puppies and kittens. Wes walked past them to the section where the older dogs were kept, the ones whose time was running out, whose chances of adoption decreased with every passing day. He found him in the third kennel, a russet-colored mixed breed, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with greying around the muzzle and kind, tired eyes. The card on the kennel said his name was Copper and that he'd been surrendered when his elderly owner passed away. Wes knelt down in front of the kennel. Copper stood up slowly, arthritic but steady, and came to the gate. He sniffed Wes's hand through the chain link, then sat down and looked at him with an expression that seemed to say, "Well, what do you think?" "Hey there, Copper," Wes said softly. "You looking for a home?" Copper's tail swept the concrete floor once, twice. An hour later, Wes drove home with Copper in the passenger seat. The dog sat calmly, looking out the window with interest but no anxiety, as if he understood that his wandering was over. At the cabin, Copper explored carefully, sniffing corners and doorways, taking stock of his new territory. Wes watched, remembering those first days with Grover, and felt both the ache of that loss and the hope of this new beginning. They were different, Grover and Copper. Grover had been energy and enthusiasm. Copper was calm and measured, content to lie by the fire while Wes worked, but different didn't mean less. Just different. That evening, Phyllis stopped by and found Wes on the porch with Copper lying at his feet. "So you did it," she said, smiling. "I'm proud of you. Figured it was time." And Dr. Brennan said Copper's been at the shelter for 4 months. Nobody wanted an old dog. Their loss. Phyllis reached down to pet Copper, who accepted the attention with dignified grace. "He suits you." The next day was Grover's birthday. Annie had invited Wes to a party at their new apartment. They'd moved out of transitional housing the month before into a modest 2-bedroom that Irving could afford on his own. Wes brought a new tennis ball and the birthday card Annie had requested he sign. When he arrived, Grover greeted him with enthusiasm but quickly returned to Annie's side. It still stung a little, that shift in loyalty, but Wes understood it. That's where Grover belonged. "Mr. Wes brought someone," Annie announced, spotting Copper in the truck. "Is that okay?" Wes asked Irving. "Thought maybe the dogs could meet." "Of course." He brought Copper in, and after some cautious sniffing, the two dogs settled into easy companionship. Grover was still the younger, more energetic one, trying to engage Copper in play. Copper tolerated it with patient, good humor, occasionally indulging in a gentle tussle. Annie sat beside Wes on the couch, watching the dogs. "Are you happy now, Mr. Wes, with Copper?" "I am," Wes said, and realized he meant it. Not the same kind of happy as with Grover, but happy in its own way. "Good. Daddy says you taught us that love means letting go sometimes, but I think it also means holding on to new things when they come." "That's very wise, Annie." She leaned against him, comfortable and trusting. "I'm glad we're friends." "Me too, sweetie." Later, as Wes drove home with Copper beside him, he took a different route, one that passed by the creek where everything had started. He pulled over and got out, Copper following slowly, and they walked to the water's edge. The log was still there, weathered now, part of the landscape. Wes stood looking at it, and for the first time, the memory didn't bring pain, just gratitude. "A lot started here," he told Copper. "A whole new life, really." Copper sat beside him, solid and patient, and Wes rested his hand on the dog's head. He thought about Lloyd, about Catherine, about all the losses that had shaped him. But he also thought about Grover, about Annie and Irving, about Phyllis and Dr. Brennan and the Thursday coffee group, about Copper, who'd been alone in a shelter kennel and was now sitting beside a creek in the spring sunshine. Life was full of endings, yes, but it was also full of beginnings, of second chances, of unexpected grace. Wes picked up the walking stick. He'd brought a new one he'd carved over the winter. This one had images carved into the wood: a dog, a creek, a compass, a story told in pictures, a reminder of the journey, from loss to healing to hope. "Come on, Copper," he said. "Let's go home." They walked back through the spring woods, man and dog together, the afternoon sun warm on their backs. Behind them, the creek flowed on, constant and unchanging. Ahead, the path led home to a cabin that was no longer empty, to a life that was no longer just motion without meaning. Wes Mallery had learned something important in these past months. Sometimes saving something else really does save yourself, and sometimes letting go is the greatest act of love you can offer. He'd lost his brother, his wife, and even Grover. But he'd gained something too, the knowledge that his heart could break and heal, could lose and love again, could remain open even when staying closed seemed safer. At the cabin, he settled into the rocking chair with Copper at his feet and his journal in his lap. He wrote about the day, about Grover's birthday, about the rightness of watching that dog thrive with his true family. He wrote about Copper, about new beginnings, about choosing to stay open to life's possibilities. As the sun set behind the oak trees, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, Wes closed his journal and simply sat. The woods were alive with evening sounds. Copper snored softly. The rocking chair creaked with familiar rhythm. And Wes Mallery, at 60 years old, felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. Not the end of grief, but the beginning of acceptance. He was home. He was whole, and he was ready for whatever came next.